Welcome to the Republican Professor. I'm your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is Tuesday, 17 February, 2026 years after Jesus. Like I said, it's a Tuesday. We're back in F.F. Bruce and the history of Israel, his excellent little monograph called Israel and the Nations. We're talking about King Solomon today. We did David last time. The subtitle is From the Exodus to the Fall of the Second Temple, as you know. And as we've said before, F.F. Bruce is my spiritual and intellectual grandfather. His doctorate was from the University of Aberdeen, one of the four medieval universities. There's two in Scotland. One is St Andrews, and one is Aberdeen. And then the two in one's the Anglo-Saxon, remember East Anglia and Mercia? Oxfordshire is in Mercia, and I think Cambridge is in East Anglia, which became England. And F.F. Bruce taught and mentored my professor and mentor, Bruce Demarest. I know with all these Bruces, it's hard to keep track. Bruce Demarest taught me at Denver Seminary. He was one of the architects of a contemporary spiritual formation movement in the Protestant world. And along with figures like Richard Foster and Austin Willard. No, not Austin. Houston Willard. No, wait, that's not his name. Um, El Paso Willard. No, that's not it either. I knew it was a Texas town. Waco Willard. That's not it either. Fort Worth Willard is his name. Fort Worth Willard was at the University of Southern California. No, that doesn't sound right either. What's that? Huh? Say again. Dallas Willard. That's what it was. Sorry. Dallas Willard. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. My next guess was going to be Rowlett, but Dallas, yeah, makes more sense. Um, yeah, okay. So Dallas Willard. Okay, sorry. Dallas Willard, along with Bruce Demarest, so Bruce Demarest was my direct professor, my direct mentor and professor. Uh, Dallas Willard, I have that right? Okay. Are you sure it's not San Angelo Willard? What? No, no, it's not Abilene Willard. I know for sure. It's not. No, it's not Abilene. No, no. Yeah, it was definitely in Texas. Oh, that's true. Corpus Christi Willard is a possibility because of the Christi part. It's not Christi as in like Chris, like a girl's name. It's like Christ. Anyway, okay, Latin. Well, these are really pretty lame jokes, I know. But if you know, you know. And if you don't, well, I'm sorry. There's no hope for you. F.F. Bruce was a Rylands professor of biblical criticism and exegesis at the University of Manchester in England. And he wrote this book, Israel and the Nations. We're going to do a fair use transformative reading of this material. It was originally published by Erdman's. We're going to be discussing and interacting with it. And he's got what was this? 1963 Paternoster Press originally. But this is Erdman's, okay? And this edition is, I guess, 1969. So let's get to Solomon and our discussion of Solomon. Like I said, we covered David last time, um, and the capture of Jerusalem and all that. Here we're on page 35, chapter 4. Solomon and his successors circa 970 to 881 BC, but that's before Christ. Solomon's reign, F. Bruce begins, had not long begun before he got rid, by one means or another, of those who had supported Adonijah's claim as well as the luckless Adonijah himself. Welcome to Biblical Ethics and Politics 101. I'm going to take a drink of coffee while you reflect on that first sentence. Oh, American politics is so awful and horrible. Well, let's keep reading. Let's keep thinking about this. Solomon was no warrior, as David was, but he set himself to exploit the commercial possibilities of the empire which his father had conquered and bequeathed to him as a glorious inheritance. Much of the wealth of the empire he used to effect a much more grandiose style of court life than his father's. He amassed a very large harem, and the harem only had one woman, and she was huge. Ah, there's that would be amphibole because a very large it's a grammatical unclarity. The words mean the same thing, so it's not equivocation. It's does does a very large pertain to number, or does it pertain to a member of a one member set? Okay, consisting in large part of daughters of neighboring princes and sheiks with whom he had political and commercial agreements. He engaged, this is Solomon, David's son. He engaged in a magnificent building program at Jerusalem, program spelled wrong, Programme. I don't know why the British don't know how to spell that word. I mean, you guys came up with English. You'd think you'd be able to spell, for gosh sakes. He came up with this magnificent building program at Jerusalem. The complex of buildings which constituted his new court included his royal palace, a palace for his queen, who was a daughter of one of the last kings of the weak 21st century Egyptian dynasty, the Hall of Pillars or Assembly Room, the Throne Room of Justice, and a treasury or armory called the House of the Forest of Lebanon, probably because it was paneled in cedar wood. Hmm. I've heard of these forests of Lebanon. I wish I could have seen them. It would be great to have seen that. But more important and imposing than any of these was the house which King Solomon built for Yahweh north of the citadel of Jerusalem, on a site which David his father had bought from its Jebusite owner to use as a place of propitiatory sacrifice at a time when Jerusalem was devastated by a pestilence. Here was a natural rock altar where, according to later Jewish tradition, Abraham had prepared to offer up Isaac, his son. Man, I'm going to read footnote 1, which is right here. It was only later that the land of Moriah from Genesis 22:2, perhaps originally the land of Morah or Shechem, was identified with Mount Moriah, the name given to the Temple Hill in 2 Chronicles 3:1. Bottom page 35. And we're interacting with, again, F. Bruce's Israel and the Nations. 1963 originally. Uh, this one has illustrations, 63 illustrations. Sorry, 36 illustrations and three maps. This was the one with illustrations, 1969. The subtitle, From the Exodus to the Fall of the Second Temple. Go out and get a copy today. Support publishers and writers. Support your local bookstore. Okay, so that bit about Isaac and his son and Abraham. Okay, and here, this is the site of the temple. And here was erected the great temple of Solomon on a spot where sacrifices were to be offered to the God of Israel, but with two interruptions for a full millennium. Holy crap. Wow. Here's footnote two. That is after the destruction by Nebuchadnezzar in 587 BC and during the profanation under Antiochus Epiphanes from 167 to 164 BC. I'm going to take a drink of coffee, ponder this. All right, page 36. This is a short chapter, but it's full of great politics and theology here. But the consequence was that Solomon fell heavily into debt and had to mortgage part of his territory to Hiram. With the aid of Hiram and his Phoenician fleet, too, Solomon developed the commercial opportunities which arose from the fact that the road from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea and Indian Ocean ran through his kingdom. Solomon himself had a fleet of merchantmen based on Aqaba. Oh, there's that term again, Aqaba, the Gulf of Aqaba. Remember Lawrence of Arabia? Did you see the film? Well, it's in the book too. You don't really see much of it except for until I think around page 300 or something out of 800 pages, uh, which sailed with the Phoenician fleet to the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean ports. Indian Ocean, I think it's Native American Ocean. I don't know. It's just so awkward that he's not using the politically correct terms. Bringing home from Ophir almug wood and precious stones, and from other parts gold, silver, ivory, apes, and peacocks. Or were the peacocks really baboons? There's a footnote there. How could you confuse those two things? The footnote is okay, Ophir, probably from Somalia. And then the baboons has a footnote. The Hebrew word in 1 Kings 10:22 is tekuyim, which may be connected with Sinhalese tokay, peacock, or more probably with Egyptian Q, which is a kind of monkey. Okay, very interesting. So I guess there were apes running around Solomon's place. Fascinating. At Aqaba, oh, two was a refinery mainly for copper. This is fascinating that Solomon, okay, Aqaba 2 was a refinery mainly for copper, great quantities, which are to be found in the vicinity. Huh. This is before they found the copper in Wales, I think. Way before they found copper in Wales. Wales had a lot of copper, uh, but used for iron as well. The refinery was built at a point where full use could be made of the violent winds and sandstorms from the north that blow along the center of the Wadi Araba as if forced through a wind tunnel. And you see that in the film Lawrence of Arabia. It's also in the book. In fact, the last section I read, I'm reading through it right now, bit by bit. I've had the book for 30 years. I'm not kidding you. I've had this same copy of the book, Lawrence of Arabia, for 30 years. Actually, 31 years. And um, I was a member of the History Book Club when I was in the Navy. And so they would send me a book every month in the mail, and I would pay by check. And so I amassed quite a library of historical books when I was in the Navy. And I got so many books I couldn't keep up with them. So recently, I think it was last year, I believe it was 2025, I was looking at this Lawrence of Arabia book that has been on my shelf, and I've looked at it a million times. It's been on my shelf for 30 years, and I was like, you know what? This is ridiculous. I'm going to read that sucker. So I took it out. It's 1,000 pages with endnotes and footnotes and illustrations and photos and stuff. And I'm past page 300 now. I'm almost halfway through. I usually read it over a cigar. And the Gulf, so I just came upon the 1916 part, which is the Gulf of Aqaba and the sandstorms when he goes through to try to get intelligence from the Bedouin tribes directly. Anyway, trying to turn the Arab Bedouin against the Turkish, which were on the side of Germany, against England. So it's a fascinating read, very interesting. Okay, so I didn't know that before reading. I mean, I've read this book before, and I'm always amazed that Solomon had connections with Aqaba and copper and all. To me, it's just still amazing to me the way that F. Bruce drafts this, because Aqaba isn't exactly close to Israel. It's not like right next door or anything like that. It's a ways. Um, I think, at least I think. I don't normally think of Israel kind of including that area down there. But so a forced draft system for the furnaces was employed and later abandoned and forgotten to be rediscovered only in modern times. Jeez. The strong and continuous winds from the north made it possible by means of a system of flues and air channels to operate the smelting plants economically without employing an expensive bellows system. Here, no doubt, the copper was refined, which was used in such abundance for the vessels of the temple. When the metal had been smelted at Aqaba, the vessels were cast farther north in the Jordan Valley. In the plain of the Jordan, the king cast them in the clay ground between Succoth and Zarethan. That's from 1 Kings 7:46. Nor was it only from seaborne trade that Solomon amassed his wealth. He acquired large revenues because his kingdom lay across the main route from Egypt to Asia Minor and Mesopotamia. Asia Minor is Turkey. Mesopotamia is Iraq. And one valuable source of income was the horse and chariot trade with Asia Minor, in which he acted as a middleman. Remember Asia Minor? Remember the steppe people? They were on horses. Okay, remember not, maybe not. Maybe you don't remember this. The steppe people would come in on horses. If they didn't have horses, nobody could cross all that Russian territory without horses. You just couldn't do it. No way. So the horses and Arabians had horses too. In fact, that's the name of a type of horse. Uh, One valuable source of income was the horse and chariot trade. Remember, the Spanish got horses, probably from Arabia. and they brought them into North America. That's where the Indians, the American Indians, got horses. They didn't have horses before. Can you imagine trying to kill buffalo without horses or any kind of big game? It's just amazing to me. Well, anyway, you got horses. BTW, and he doesn't mention this in the footnotes. I think he's just assuming you know. I don't know. But you want to look at Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy is the last of the five books of Moses, chapter 17. Look for the term horses. It's a very important point related to what we're reading here. Also look for the term women and wives. Also a very important point. One valuable source of income was the horse and chariot trade with Asia Minor, which he acted as a middleman. Quote, Solomon's import of horses was from Musri and Kew, which is probably Cappadocia and Cilicia. And the king's traders received them from Kew at a price. Kew is spelled Kue. A chariot could be exported from Musri for 600 shekels of silver and a horse for 150. And so through the king's traders, they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria. And that is quoting 1 Kings 10:28 and following in the scriptures. Egypt in RSV and older versions should be replaced by Musri, a a district in Southeast Asia Minor. This is a translation point. Notice that F. Bruce is disagreeing with the Revised Standard Version, but he's disagreeing as Ryland's professor of biblical criticism and exegesis at the University of Manchester. In other words, he's not just your local Bible study leader. This is fascinating. This is fascinating. Page 37 at the top. Trade with Egypt was no doubt facilitated by Solomon's alliance with the Egyptian king, his father-in-law. When Solomon received the Egyptian princess in marriage, he received a handsome dowry with her, for her father captured the city of Gezer from the Canaanites who occupied it, handed over to Solomon, who rebuilt and fortified it. Other cities which Solomon fortified, apart from Jerusalem itself, were the strategic stronghold of Megiddo, Hazor in the far north, Haran in the central area, and Baalat and Tamar in the territory of Judah. Solomon not only acquired a large revenue from the horses and chariots which passed through his hands, he built up a large force of chariots and horses for himself. And again, you want to pay attention to Deuteronomy chapter 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17. The last of the five books of Moses, Deuteronomy chapter 17. The narrative of First Kings refers to the cities which Solomon built for his chariots and horsemen. Mhm. This is First Kings 4, verses 7 through 19. Again, you want to go to Deuteronomy chapter 17 and First Kings chapter 4, 7 through 19. Write it down. I mean, that's always a good idea. Like you hear something, take a pencil, get something to write with, get something to write with. Okay. See, it's what we call paper. And you can use your hand to transfer what you heard onto paper for later. And then you can look it up in a book later, and it goes in your mind and in your soul and in your heart. That's how it works. Just cluing you in, just in case you've been intellectually and spiritually molested the past 15 years or so by Democrats, primarily. Let's keep going. Now, we may be sure that Solomon's horses were better housed than many of Solomon's subjects were. Hmm. This is painting a very interesting picture. But the ordinary income of his empire and the revenue which came to him from the commerce that passed through his realm were not sufficient to maintain the expensive establishment which Solomon set up and the building program which occupied so much of his 40 years' reign. He found it necessary to impose increasingly heavy taxes on his subjects and to exact forced labor from them. In other words, Solomon is a Democrat. At first, this forced labor was supplied by his non-Israelite subjects, but later it was extended to Israelites as well. Quote, he sent them to Lebanon, unquote, where we are told, quote, 10,000 a month in relays. They would be a month in Lebanon, 2 months at home, unquote. That's 1 Kings 5:14. This corvée system was a serious departure from the ideals of Israel's early free polity and was regarded as a breach of Yahweh's covenant, which bound king and people alike. Nothing did so much to alienate the tribes of Israel from the dynasty of David. Moreover, the kingdom of Israel was divided into 12 administrative districts, largely but not entirely following the old tribal boundaries. Each of these districts was administered by a royal commissioner and was responsible to send food supplies for the court for 1 month in a year. Sorry, that is 1 Kings 4, chapter 4, verse 7 through 19. I apologize. The previous one about the chariots and horsemen, that is supposed to be 1 Kings 9:19 and 10:26. I'm sorry about that confusion. Um, I need new glasses, apparently. The first footnote, the one from First Kings about the horses and chariots, says the remains of stables at Megiddo, formerly thought to be Solomon's, have been shown by Y. Yaden to belong more probably to Ahab's reign. Interesting. Okay, whatever that's worth. Israel and Judah enjoyed peace throughout the reign of Solomon, but the prosperity and joy which accompanied that peace to begin with turned to disillusionment toward the end of his reign. He placed on his realm burdens too heavy to bear, and it fell to pieces at his death. Nevertheless, the memory of his earlier years, before the burden of forced labor and taxation became so heavy, was cherished by the people for long. And in later days, when Israel and Judah fell into harder times, the glories of a golden age to come were based to a considerable extent on the recollection of the time when peace and prosperity were established under a king of Israel who ruled the territory between the Wadi at Egypt's frontier and the great river Euphrates, while while the coming king was pictured as as combining in his person the military genius of David and the arts of peace associated with Solomon. Now, I think I want to read that part again. I think it's worth really thinking about here in preparation for the Christian tradition here and how the Christian tradition understands this material and incorporates it into the Christian ethnic identity and in the American ethnic identity in terms of American politics. Okay. Um, Israel and Judah enjoyed peace throughout the reign of Solomon. But the prosperity and joy which accompanied that peace to begin with turned to disillusionment toward the end of his reign. Well, after we just read that, there's heavy taxation, there's slavery. Yeah, there's problems, right? He's violating the commands in Deuteronomy 17. He's departing what F. Bruce calls a serious departure from the ideals of Israel's early free polity and a breach of Yahweh's covenant, which bound king and people alike. Nothing did so much to alienate the tribes of Israel from the dynasty of David. That's F. Bruce, page 37, a little bit more than halfway down. Now, why does Solomon have any kind of positive reputation at all as a wise person? You need to really think about that. I taught a course on Ecclesiastes for my church. It was Chuck Swindoll's old church, E.V. Free Fullerton. This was about going on 20 years ago. And I challenged some of the preconceptions of people that Solomon was a wise person and that you want to have this as your starting point in reading Ecclesiastes. And we took a really close critical look at the language that's actually in Ecclesiastes and showed that there was a lot more to it than that. I did use a lot of Tremper Longman. He's an anti-Trumper. He's been molested by Democrats. He has a good he's spiritually and intellectually molested by Democrats, but he does have a good um, uh, commentary on Ecclesiastes. It's pretty helpful. Um, something you want to think about is like when it talks about Solomon observing the labor that's done under the sun. You have to remember he's a rich kid. He didn't do any labor, you know. He's sipping margaritas, watching other people do the labor that he imposed. That's just one example, okay? You want to remember who's supposed to be writing this. That's if he wrote it. Uh, he talks about meaninglessness and stuff like, well, he's got time to sit around and think about that because he's got a slave system going on. And he's got a Democrat implantation where he's imposing taxes that are far too great to bear. And he's departing from the founding principles. It's a serious departure from the ideals of Israel's early free polity. This is the language of F. Bruce. And a serious departure from which was, in fact, regarded as a breach of Yahweh's covenant, which bound king and people alike. Nothing did so much to alienate the tribes of Israel from the dynasty of David. Now, why does he have the reputation as a wise person? You have the Proverbs. Well, those are in the scriptures. what what are we supposed to think of Solomon? We have these conflicting reports here. He's really wise. He's also incredibly dumb, and he's a brat, and he's skillful, sure, as a politician, a diplomat, sure, but he lacks common sense, which a lot of rich people do. A lot of rich kids do. He lacks common sense. Now, David had flaws too. He has some street cred because, as F. Bruce says on bottom of page 37, Israel and Judah enjoyed peace throughout the reign of Solomon. Well, there you go. There's a lot of street cred. But that peace came at a cost, a large cost. As F. Bruce says, the prosperity and joy which accompanied that peace to begin with turned to disillusionment toward the end of his reign. He placed on his realm burdens too heavy to bear, and it fell to pieces at his death. See, how successful was he really? It didn't pass on. It didn't catch. Reminds me of Social Security. In a way, the Democrats thought they're saving America, creating peace and prosperity, but this is a burden too heavy to bear. It's unsustainable. When you place government in the center of the private affairs of the family, and you put the government budget, the main role of the government budget as transferring $1 to one person and to another person while the government extracts resources of its own for its own purposes. That was brand new in American history. I mean, I'm talking about on a wide scale. There had been pensions before and stuff like that, but this was a wide scale thing tied to income tax, taxing labor, taxing working people. And these Social Security benefits are not wealth that can be transferred to the next generation. They're owned by the government, not by the family. That was brand new in American history. This is leading to disillusionment, I think, because there's burdens too heavy to bear. There's only two ways that a government, well, there's three ways, but there's two main ways that a government can get revenue. Taxation, that includes tariffs, sales tax, property tax, income tax, death tax, birth tax, whatever you want to do, transfer tax, any number of these fees and taxes. That's one. The second is by military conquest. Those are the two ways that government can get revenue. And if you max out the taxation action, the only other option is military conquest. That is always the temptation, always. Empire. You have to. There's no other option. I said there's a third way. The third way is that in a way it can be seen as just a subset of the first way. That is to nationalize an industry and extract profits from that. But that's really a form of heavy taxation, the most extreme form, where you just confiscate property outright. Taxation is really confiscation of property. That's what it is. Do you think that this has nothing to do with American politics? I'm going to tell you you're wrong. You're totally off. You're completely off. In any case, this is part of the Christian tradition. And Christians were the vast majority of the people that understood what they were doing when they created the American regime. And you got to be familiar with this stuff. Whether you agree with it or not is not exactly on point right now, although I hope you agree with it. But I'm not doing apologetics here. I'm doing American regime analysis. We're doing a deep dive on the Christian tradition here. And this is all really important background in even understanding where we're at and how people thought about where we were at, which is part of understanding where we're at. Hmm. So he placed on his realm burdens too heavy to bear, and it fell to pieces at his death. Nevertheless, the memory of his earlier years before the burden of forced labor and taxation became so heavy was cherished. This is why he has some street cred. Was cherished by the people for long. And in later days, when Israel and Judah fell into harder times, the glories of a golden age make Israel great again. The glories of a golden age to come were based to a considerable extent on the recollection of the time when peace and prosperity were established under a king of Israel who ruled the territory between the Wadi at Egypt's frontier and the great river Euphrates, while the coming king was pictured as combining in his person the military genius of David and the arts of peace associated with Solomon. And they're talking about the messianic figures that occur in Scripture and that Christians believe were actually the Son of God, Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth, called the Christ, who actually was the Christ being the term for Messiah. This is page 38 at the top. Among the arts of peace which flourished under Solomon may be reckoned literature of various kinds. The architectural achievements of his reign were Phoenician rather than Israelite, but the national epic and the court chronicle flourished, together with the quote wisdom unquote, and he has that word in quotations, for which Solomon became renowned in all succeeding ages. For he, quote, uttered 3,000 proverbs, unquote, we read, and, quote, his songs were 1,005, unquote. While his acquaintance with natural lore won him fame among all his neighbors and more distant peoples as well, yet the features of his reign that mattered most for Israel at the time were features that marked a departure from the ancient ideals of the nation. A departure. Toward the end of Solomon's reign, a change of regime took place in Egypt. The weak 21st dynasty to which Solomon's father-in-law belonged, came to an end, and a new and ambitious king, and his name was Shishonk or Shishak, as the biblical narrative calls him, 945 to 914 BC, assumed the double crown as first ruler of the 22nd dynasty. Okay, good. The main direction in which ambitious kings of Egypt had looked in centuries gone by was toward Asia. The Mediterranean coastal road ran north to Megiddo, where it turned east through the pass into the plain of Jezreel and crossed the Jordan, to turn again and run through Syria as far as Carchemish, where the Euphrates might be forded. Incidentally, Lawrence, he was a lieutenant at the time. No, actually, this is before he was lieutenant. Oh, it might have been when he was lieutenant. He excavated Carchemish for the British Museum. Very interesting. Um, where the Euphrates might. Okay, so when Shishak came to the throne, this road from his own frontier as far as the Euphrates was controlled by Solomon. It was therefore to his interest to weaken Solomon's power. This he did in particular by encouraging any movement for independence that showed itself among Solomon's subject peoples. And there was no lack of such movements. Early in Solomon's reign, a former officer of Hadadezer, king of Zobah, Rezin by name, led an independence movement which made its headquarters at Damascus. And he became a founder of a royal dynasty which ruled in Damascus for 200 years. Wow. Again, Hadad, crown prince of Edom, who had been carried to Egypt as a child when David conquered Edom, grew up at the Egyptian court and in due course returned to Edom with Egyptian backing to raise the standard of revolt in his native land. Page 39 at the top. These were non-Israelites, but more ominous still was the encouragement which Shishak gave to Jeroboam, the son of Nebat. Jeroboam was one of Solomon's officials, whose organizing capacity shone at the repair of the fortifications of Jerusalem, won for him the charge of the corvée provided by the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. But the prophetic party, which was opposed to the innovating trends of Solomon's policy, marked out this Jeroboam as one to whom the national loyalty could be diverted. And the suggestion was sown in Jeroboam's mind by the acted prophecy of one of their number, Ahijah of Shiloh. When Solomon got wind of the matter, Jeroboam escaped to Egypt and remained under Shishak's protection until Solomon died. Solomon's death, and that was circa 930 BC, coincided with the collapse of David's empire and was followed by the disruption of the United Kingdoms of Israel and Judah itself. The long separation of Judah from the northern tribes made them think of Judah as almost an alien territory. When a Judean dynasty acquired supreme power, the situation called for special qualities of diplomacy and consideration if the loyalty of the northern tribes was to be retained. Unfortunately, the northern tribes found cause to suspect that Judah was being increasingly favored at their expense. When, therefore, the tribes came together after Solomon's death to elect his successor, great care and tact were called for if the unity of the realm was to be maintained. The tribal delegates met at Shechem, one of the most venerable of the holy places in central Canaan. The dynasty of David had not completely dissipated the fund of goodwill, which it once enjoyed. Its prestige was still very great, and the people were prepared to accept Solomon's son Rehoboam as king if he would return to the terms of the ancient covenant which his father's oppressive measures had violated. That's a pretty serious criticism of Solomon by F. Bruce in his Israel and the Nations, the subtitle of which is From the Exodus to the Fall of the Second Temple, Erdman's 1969, this edition, 1963 originally, Paternoster Press. We'd like to thank F.F. Bruce for writing this, and we'd like to thank Erdman's for making it available. Go out and get your copy today. Get a copy, support your local bookstore. We're discussing this material in the context of American politics as well, not just for biblical literacy, but for our political understanding. Recall in his introduction, you recall this on page 11 and 12? Page 11 at the bottom. While these books have come down to us as Holy Scripture, they are historical source documents of first-rate worth. The chapters which follow are not concerned with them as canonical writings, but as material for constructing a political narrative. Page 12 at the top. All right, let's continue. I'm going to read that last sentence again. The dynasty of David had not completely dissipated the fund of goodwill which it once enjoyed. Its prestige was still very great, and the people were prepared to accept Solomon's son Rehoboam as king if he would return to the terms of the ancient covenant, which his father's oppressive measures had violated. But Rehoboam, with almost incredible folly, refused to give them the satisfaction which they requested, or to promise an alleviation of the burden which Solomon had placed upon them. The reaction was immediate and violent. The northern tribes threw off their allegiance to a dynasty which would not recognize that it had obligations to its subjects, nor had they far to look for an alternative choice to Rehoboam. Jeroboam, all these Boams, had lately come back from Egypt and, in fact, took the lead among the tribal delegates who stated their terms to Rehoboam. There at Shechem, they proclaimed Jeroboam king, and there he made his capital. Rehoboam, seeing the hostility of the delegates, hurried home in his chariot to Jerusalem. He had good cause to seek the safety of Jerusalem, for when he tried to assert his authority over the rebel tribes by sending the officer in charge of the corvée to the delegates, they showed what they thought of him and his royal master by stoning him to death. That's right. They took pipes filled with pot. They made him get so high he died. That's called stoning, getting stoned to death. Page 40 at the top. As a result of his folly, Rehoboam was left with a tiny kingdom consisting of the tribe of Judah and the small tribe of Benjamin on its northern boundary, within whose territory Jerusalem was situated. He was, however, not resourceless. He still had great wealth and a powerful army at his command, and he prepared to invade the northern territory and put down the revolt by force. But a spokesman, its spokesperson, Bruce, jeez, sexism. But a spokesman of the prophetic party forbade him to do so, and such was the respect of the such was the respect that the prophets could command that Rehoboam stayed his hand. The division between the two parts of the nation had come to stay. Man. The immediate cause of the division was economic. The people were tired of the burdensome taxation and forced labor which they had to endure under Solomon, and they saw no prospect of an alleviation of their burden under his son. The jealousy of the northern tribes against Judah played its part, as also did Egyptian intrigue. But the action of the prophetic party must not be forgotten. Samuel, the prophet, had played his part in preparing the way for David's rise to power. And in succeeding generations, members of the prophetic guilds, which he appears to have founded, continued to remind the kings of both North and South that the principles of democratic Yahwism could not be lightly disregarded. The kingdom then was divided politically, but religiously it was united in terms of the intertribal covenant. The ark, symbol of this unity, was enshrined in the temple at Jerusalem, which thus remained the central sanctuary of the Amphictyony. Had Jerusalem and its temple had nothing more than this religious significance, all might have been well. But Jerusalem was also Rehoboam's capital, and the temple was his royal chapel as well as being the central shrine for all Israel. Jeroboam was afraid that if northern Israelites continued to visit Jerusalem for religious purposes, something of their old feeling of allegiance to the house of David might revive. Jeroboam was afraid of that, the northern king. He therefore raised two ancient sanctuaries in his realm to the status of national shrines. One was the sanctuary of Dan in the extreme north, served by a hereditary priesthood which traced its lineage back to Moses. The other was the sanctuary of Bethel, near the southern frontier of his kingdom, whose sacred associations were still more venerable, going back to Abraham and Jacob, both of whom had offered sacrifice there. What offended even more against the principles of Israel's worship under the covenant and the erection of rival sanctuaries to that at Jerusalem was that in both these sanctuaries, golden images of bull calves were installed. And if someone picked different pronouns, you had to say those pronouns. Oh, you know what? Sorry, that's not in the book. There was I don't know where that came from. I have no idea. Yeah. Does he say anything? I guess he doesn't really say that. I don't know where that came from. This infringed the anaconic principle laid down for Israel's worship in the days of Moses, and it represented a dangerous assimilation to Canaanite religious practice. Although the Canaanites, although among the Canaanites, a visible representation of the divinity was supported by the animal. Page 41 at the top. It may be asked whether there was any difference in principle between the use of bull calf images to support Yahweh's invisible presence at the use and the use of cherubs for the same purpose in the Holy of Holies at Jerusalem. I'm going to read that again. It may be asked whether there was any difference in principle between the use of bull calf images to support Yahweh's invisible presence and the use of cherubs for the same purpose in the Holy of Holies at Jerusalem. The answer probably is that the cherubs were symbolic beings representing originally the storm winds, and their images were therefore not any likeness of anything that is in heaven above or is in the earth beneath or that is in the water under the earth, where the bull calf images were all too closely associated with Canaanite fertility ritual. It appears from the ritual texts of Ugarit that El, the supreme god of the Canaanite pantheon, was on occasion actually hypostasized as a bull and shown as Shor El. The word for bull is Shor, just by way of background. He's interacting with passages Exodus 24, which is the Ten Commandments, and Deuteronomy 5:8, which is a restatement. And then verse 2, it's relevant to recall that the Greek myth of Europa and the bull, which has Phoenician affinities. Okay, let's keep going here. At any rate, Jeroboam's elevation of the shrines of Dan and Bethel to be rivals to Jerusalem, and his installation of the golden bull calf images in these shrines are together stigmatized throughout the narrative of the Book of Kings as, quote, the sin of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel to sin, unquote. In the fifth year after the disruption of the kingdom, and that would be 925 BC, Shishak mounted an invasion of Palestine from Egypt. It wasn't called Palestine back then, but that's kind of a Roman name. But you get the point. Well, yeah, it's a name. It's an ancient name for Israel. It can be a little confusing because you have the term Palestinians is a contemporary term, which is usually in contrast to Israel. So I want to make sure that you know it's the same territory. Okay. And it does refer to where Jews live in in these historical narratives. Um, you have to make these clarifications because otherwise you see like for example, you'll see a textbook like by E.P. Sanders called Paul and Palestinian Judaism, and you won't have any idea what he's talking about unless you understand the background here. Um, so we have two accounts of the invasion, that is Shishak coming in. The Judean account preserved in First Kings, chapters 14 through 25 and following, and Second Chronicles 12, starting in verse 1 and following. And an Egyptian account preserved on a pylon of the temple of Ammon at Karnak. The Judean account concentrates on Shishak's appropriating the ceremonial shields of gold in Jerusalem, carried by the royal bodyguard when the king entered the temple, and on their replacement by shields of bronze. The Egyptian account gives us further information. In addition to a relief picturing Shishak's victory, there is a list of conquered cities of Asia, of which about 120 names are legible, and a number of these are identified as Israelite cities. It is plain that his invasion was not confined to Judah, for the list includes cities which he took in the northern kingdom as far north as Megiddo and the plain of Jezreel, and eastward across the Jordan. Probably Jeroboam, whom Shishak regarded as his vassal, did not pay him the respect which he claimed, but conducted himself as an independent king. And so he, as well as Jeroboam, suffered at Shishak's hand. The southern kingdom in particular was gravely weakened, both in money and in manpower, as a result of Shishak's invasion. And the kings of Judah could no longer think seriously of reconquering the revolted tribes to the north. This did not lead them to make peace, however. It led them to seek allies, and they found them in the kings of Damascus, the successors of that Rezon who founded a dynasty there in the reign of Solomon. Uh, Abijah, Rehoboam's son, enlisted the aid of Tabrimum, king of Damascus, against Israel, and the alliance was renewed between their sons Asa and Ben-Hadad, Ben-Hadad I, respectively. The kings of Israel thus to keep watch on their southern and northeastern frontiers simultaneously. If they tried to take offensive action against Judah, they had to expect an invasion from the north. Thus, about 890 BC, Baasha fortified the frontier town of Ramah as an outpost against Judah, and also, it appears, to prevent any of his own subjects going over to Judah. The pull of Jerusalem and the Davidide dynasty was still strong. A rare exclamation point here in F.F. Bruce. He got excited there, over there in University of Manchester Library. Asa, king of Judah at the time, sent a message to Ben-Hadad, who responded by invading Israel and overrunning a good part of the territory north of the plain of Jezreel. Baasha had to hasten north to deal with this greater threat, and during his absence, the king of Judah organized compulsory work parties from Judah who demolished the fortifications of Ramah and carried away all the material to build two fortresses in his own Benjamite territory against the northern realm. The name of Asa is also associated with a religious reformation in Judah. He made a clean sweep of Canaanite cultic objects and institutions which were included in the apparatus of Yahweh worship at various local shrines, high places throughout the land. Stern measures were adopted even in his own household. The queen mother, Maacah, was deposed from her dignity, which was more than a nominal one, because she maintained a shrine of her own and an image or sacred pole representing the Canaanite goddess Asherah. We're on the last paragraph here in this wonderful chapter called Solomon and His Successors in F.F. Bruce's wonderful Israel and the Nations, subtitle of which is From the Exodus to the Fall of the Second Temple, 1963, Paternoster Press, 1969, Erdman's, with illustrations. The purpose of which, of course, he says in his introduction, page 11 and 12, while these books have come down to us as Holy Scripture, they are historical source documents of first-rate worth. The chapters which follow are not concerned with them as canonical writings, but as material for constructing a political narrative. Yeah, a political narrative. Wonderful. F.F. Bruce, Ryland's professor of biblical criticism and exegesis at the University of Manchester. Here we go. We're going to finish this chapter and our discussion for today. Weak though the southern kingdom was, it remained loyal to the house of David, which remained in power so long as the kingdom itself did, a period of 340 years after the death of Solomon. There was much less dynastic stability in the northern kingdom. There, only two dynasties, those founded by Omri about 881 BC and by Jehu 40 years later, lasted more than two generations. Lasted for more than two generations. Jeroboam's son was assassinated by Baasha, one of his army officers, in the year after he succeeded to the kingdom, when Baasha had reigned 24 years. A similar fate befell his son and successor. A few years of civil war followed between various rivals for the succession. The survivor, Omri, was one of the greatest kings in the northern kingdom. And chapter 5 is called The House of Omri, 881 to 841 BC. Starting on page 43. Where's my bookmarker? What the heck did I do? The heck, where did my bookmarker go? Thank you for joining me on the Republican Professor podcast. I have been your host, Dr. Lucas J. Mather. Today is Tuesday, 17 February 2026, years after Jesus. It's a Tuesday. God bless you guys. Take care. We'll see you next time.